Imagine a relentless, consuming force that dictates its own weather patterns, outpaces a fleeing vehicle, and buries itself underground only to erupt behind you when you think you are safe. Now, imagine two of them, unleashed simultaneously across a landscape that was never supposed to burn this way. Right now, an unprecedented crisis is unfolding across the American Southeast. An entire state is mobilizing against an enemy it has never faced on this scale. The skies are choked with ash, military helicopters are carving through thick smoke, and tens of thousands of acres of dense, historic timberland are simply vanishing. But the most terrifying aspect of this disaster isn't just the acreage lost or the homes reduced to cinders. It is the chilling realization of exactly why this is happening, the bizarre mechanics of how these specific fires are surviving, and the haunting preview it offers of a future that has already arrived. When you think of the state of Georgia, you think of oppressive summer humidity. You think of afternoon thunderstorms, sprawling marshlands, and dense, waterlogged forests. You do not think of towering walls of flame. But what began as a localized incident in the southern reaches of the state has rapidly mutated into a 91-county state of emergency. It is a slow-motion catastrophe that is fundamentally rewriting the rulebook on regional disaster response. The nightmare began near the Florida border, in the rural stretches of Brantley County. It started the way most wildfires do, a seemingly manageable ignition, a column of smoke spotted above the tree line. But the environment it was born into was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Within 24 hours, the fire did something that sent a shockwave through emergency management command centers. It grew to 6 times its original size. A 6-fold expansion in a single day is not just fast, it is explosive. It is the kind of exponential growth that renders containment strategies obsolete before the bulldozers even arrive. The county administration, facing a beast that was doubling and redoubling its footprint, sounded the alarm. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of acres consumed, dozens of homes entirely eradicated from the map, and a horrifyingly low containment rate hovering around 15%. That meant 85% of this sprawling inferno was completely untamed, driven entirely by the whims of the wind and the abundance of fuel. For the residents of Brantley County, the reality of the threat materialized with brutal suddenness. Mandatory evacuation orders severed people from their homes in a matter of minutes. Communities with quiet, idyllic names like Happy Hollow and Hawks Landing were suddenly frontline combat zones. Over 800 families were told to drop everything, grab whatever absolute necessities they could carry, and flee down Highway 32, a thin ribbon of asphalt that served as the only lifeline out of the encroaching dark. The local sheriff delivered a warning that stripped away any false sense of security for those who hesitated. Do not trust the distance. A fire burning a mile away is not a mile away when the atmospheric conditions shift. In extreme fire events, a sudden change in wind direction can take a distant, glowing horizon and drop it directly onto your doorstep in the time it takes to pack a suitcase. But Brantley County was only the first domino to fall. Because roughly 100 miles to the west, an even larger monster had awakened. The second front and the mathematics of disaster. Deep in the privately owned timberlands of Clinch County, the Pylons Road fire ignited. If the Brantley fire was an explosive shock to the system, the Clinch County fire was a sprawling, unstoppable titan. It quickly chewed through over 16,000 acres of dense vegetation, dwarfing the eastern blaze by a factor of 3. And the containment statistics here painted an even bleaker picture, a mere 10%. When you are dealing with a 16,000-acre footprint, a 10% containment line is essentially a rounding error. It means the fire has multiple miles of open, unguarded perimeter to exploit. It breached the borders of Clinch County, spilling aggressively into neighboring Eccles County, triggering a cascading wave of new evacuations. The chairman of the Georgia Forestry Commission stepped before the press and used 2 words that strike fear into the heart of any seasoned firefighter: serious and evolving. In the carefully measured language of disaster management, that translates to, we do not have control of this, and we do not know what it will do next. The sheer scale of this dual-front war forced the governor of Georgia to take an action with absolutely zero historical precedent. A state of emergency was declared spanning 91 separate counties. Georgia is a state intimately familiar with the wrath of nature. It has absorbed the blows of Category 4 hurricanes, paralyzing ice storms, and catastrophic inland flooding. But never in the recorded history of the state had a wildfire necessitated an emergency declaration of this magnitude. This historic decree was not merely symbolic. It was a desperate unlocking of the state's ultimate arsenal. The Georgia Department of Defense was mobilized. National Guard units, trained for combat and heavy logistics, were diverted into the smoke. Military-grade air assets, massive helicopters equipped with Bambi buckets, were deployed to dump thousands of gallons of water in areas where ground crews simply could not survive. A mandatory, uncompromising burning ban was slammed down across half the state to ensure that human carelessness did not spawn a third front. But even with the might of the military and the influx of federal FEMA grants to keep the financial lifeblood of the operation flowing, the human beings on the ground were fighting a war against physics and geography. Extreme fire behavior, when the rules no longer apply. To understand why an army of firefighters backed by military air support cannot simply extinguish these flames, you have to understand the terrifying science of what authorities are calling extreme fire behavior. When a wildfire reaches a certain critical mass, it stops being a passive reaction to its environment and starts becoming an active participant. It begins to engineer its own localized weather. The intense heat from tens of thousands of burning acres forces massive columns of air upward, creating terrifying updrafts. This violent atmospheric vacuum sucks in surrounding oxygen at gale-force speeds, generating ferocious, unpredictable surface winds. These winds are the delivery mechanism for the fire's most insidious weapon, the ember attack. The blazes in southern Georgia are not simply moving in a solid, predictable wall. The erratic winds are tearing burning branches, pine cones, and chunks of bark from the canopy and hurling them hundreds of yards, sometimes over a mile, ahead of the main fire line. These embers land in bone-dry brush and instantly spawn secondary fires. For the crews on the ground, it is a psychological nightmare. They are fighting desperately to hold a containment line, only to realize that a dozen new fires have just ignited completely behind them. It is a process known as leapfrogging, and it makes traditional suppression tactics almost impossibly dangerous. The fuel conditions driving this extreme behavior are historically bad. Fire danger indices across the region spiked as relative humidity plummeted below 20%. When the air is that dry, it actively strips moisture from the environment. Every pine needle, every dead branch, every acre of dense, unmanaged undergrowth transforms from passive vegetation into volatile kindling. But what truly separates these Georgia fires from the towering infernos we are used to seeing in the American West is the treacherous, hostile geography of the battleground itself. The invisible enemy fighting the underground inferno. Southern Georgia is not characterized by the steep, rocky canyons of California or the sprawling, dry plains of the Midwest. It is defined by its massive, dense, and historically waterlogged swamp systems, most notably the legendary Okefenokee Swamp. And this is where the firefighting effort transitions from incredibly difficult to practically impossible. When a fire enters a swamp ecosystem during a period of intense drought, you are not just fighting the flames you can see in the canopy. You are fighting the ground itself. The floor of these massive wetlands is composed of thick layers of peat, partially decayed organic matter that has built up over centuries. Normally, this peat is submerged beneath inches or feet of water. But when a prolonged dry spell sucks the swamp dry, that peat becomes highly combustible. When a surface fire sweeps through, it ignites the peat, and the fire physically drives itself underground. A peat fire is a firefighter's absolute worst-case scenario. It does not blaze with towering, visible flames, it smolders, creeping blindly beneath the surface like an invisible predator. It burns at terrifyingly high temperatures, consuming the root systems of ancient trees until they suddenly, silently collapse into the ash without warning. A crew can drown an area with thousands of gallons of water, declare the surface entirely extinguished, and move on, only for a subterranean peat fire to quietly travel beneath the containment line and spontaneously erupt on the other side weeks later. Furthermore, you cannot bring heavy machinery into a drained swamp. The massive bulldozers required to carve out protective dirt trenches, the primary method for halting a fire's advance, sink uselessly into the marshy, unstable terrain. Fire engines bog down in the muck. The 89 specialized personnel on the ground are forced to navigate this treacherous, collapsing landscape largely on foot, using hand tools to fight a monster that stretches across horizons. The fallout, a poisoned atmosphere. The devastation of these fires is not confined to the perimeter of the flames. The sheer volume of burning organic matter is generating an atmospheric crisis that is drifting hundreds of miles away, ignoring county lines and state borders. 27,000 acres of burning pine, undergrowth, and peat generate a staggering, almost incomprehensible volume of smoke. Plumes so massive they register vividly on weather satellites have billowed outward, carried by prevailing winds deep into neighboring states like South Carolina, and creeping northward to blanket major metropolitan hubs like Atlanta. For the towns and small cities sitting in the immediate shadow of the fire, places like Valdosta and Homerville, the air has turned toxic. Wildfire smoke is fundamentally different from a campfire. It is a complex, hazardous cocktail of carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and microscopic particulate matter known as PM 2.5. These particles are so infinitesimally small that they bypass the human body's natural filtration systems, traveling deep into the lungs and slipping directly into the bloodstream. health officials have issued severe, urgent warnings. For healthy individuals, the smoke causes burning eyes, scratchy throats, and lingering headaches. But for the vulnerable, those battling asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or cardiovascular issues, this smoke is a lethal trigger. It forces the lungs to work overtime, straining the heart and inducing severe respiratory distress. Pregnant women, infants, and the elderly are trapped indoors, sealing their windows against an invisible, suffocating fog that has turned the midday sun into a dim, eerie orange disk. The fires are claiming casualties miles away from the heat. The ghost of Hurricane Helene and the climate reality. How does an environment so synonymous with water burn so violently? The answer lies in a combination of long-term climate shifts and the lingering ghost of a previous disaster. Forestry scientists and environmental researchers pointing to the root cause of this crisis keep circling back to a catastrophic event from the recent past, Hurricane Helene. When Helene tore through the southeast, it snapped millions of trees like matchsticks, shredded the forest canopy, and left behind a sprawling, incalculable volume of dead timber across the forest floor. In a normal cycle, that organic matter would slowly rot, returning nutrients to the soil. But it hasn't had the chance. Instead, those millions of downed trees have spent months baking in the sun, slowly drying out, essentially acting as prepositioned fuel stockpiles waiting for an ignition source. Hurricane Helene loaded the gun, the exceptionally dry spring pulled the trigger. But blaming this entirely on the remnants of a hurricane is a dangerous oversimplification. Climate scientists are raising a much louder, more urgent alarm. The baseline conditions of the American Southeast are changing. Droughts are biting deeper and lasting longer. The seasonal windows where forests are vulnerable to ignition, once a brief, predictable period, are stretching wider every year. The humidity that once served as a natural, atmospheric fire blanket is becoming increasingly erratic. What the people of Georgia are witnessing is not a freak anomaly or a rare alignment of bad luck. According to the experts studying the data, this is the terrifying, inevitable consequence of an evolving climate. It is a preview of the new normal. As the state of emergency drags on, the prognosis from the front lines remains brutally grim. The fires are not contained. The weather forecasts offer no salvation in the form of heavy, soaking rains. The subterranean peak continues to smolder. And the fuel load remains catastrophically high. For the families sleeping in emergency shelters, wondering if their homes still exist, for the exhausted National Guard pilots flying through blinding smoke, for the residents of Atlanta coughing on the ashes of a forest burning 100 miles away, this crisis is a stark, undeniable wake-up call. We are watching the natural world flex a terrifying muscle, overwhelming our technology, our machinery, and our bravado. Georgia is fighting back with everything it has, but the inferno is far from finished. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.